Hello, thank you for coming to my talk today. I'm happy to talk to you about creep along the central San Andreas Fault. It's resolved from surface fractures, topographic differencing, and InSAR. I am Chelsea Scott. I'm a research scientist at Arizona State University. My colleagues on this work are Michael Bunds from Utah Valley University, Manoochehr Shirzaei from Virginia Tech, and Nathan Toke, also from Utah Valley University. In this study, I will look at tectonic creep along the central San Andreas Fault at the Dry Lake Valley paleoseismic site. There's two motivating questions. The first is, what is the tectonic creep rate along the San Andreas Fault? Second, is deformation localized to the fault? To answer these questions, we look at tectonic creep at three spatial scales, from largest to smallest, with data sets including InSAR, topographic differencing, and surface fractures. Using topographic differencing, which is a technique that captures deformation along and adjacent to the fault, we resolve a creep rate of 2.5 plus or minus 0.2 centimeters per year. The set of surface fractures that open along the fault during a period of drought, and surface fractures accommodate 2.2 centimeters per year of right lateral fault slip. And we conclude that 90% of fault creep is localized to a 5-meter aperture. Here is a map of the central San Andreas Fault, which lies between Los Angeles to the south and San Francisco to the north. So here, yes, is the San Andreas Fault. This other fault is the Calaveras Fault. Both faults are colored by creep rate measured from InSAR by Tong et al. 2013. Dry Lake Valley site is located right here. Here is a zoom to Dry Lake Valley. Southeast of Dry Lake Valley, the fault cuts through rugged terrain. As it enters Dry Lake Valley, it cuts across an alluvial fan, and then bounds a sag pond. This area has been the focus of extensive paleoseismic studies. These studies show pervasive deformation fabrics, including highly fractured soils along a localized fault trace. At the largest scale, we resolved tectonic creep with an InSAR time series from the Sentinel satellite. This plot here shows the line of sight surface velocity rate from a time series just over 4 years, from November 2015 to January 2020, from a descending frame. Here in this velocity plot, we see that the surface deformation is localized to the San Andreas Fault, which is right here. This is a zoom in to the Dry Lake Valley area, which again emphasizes that the deformation is localized to the San Andreas Fault. The second approach that we use to resolving deformation along the central San Andreas Fault is topographic differencing. Topographic differencing, we need to have two topographic data sets that were acquired at different times. First is the EarthScope 2007, and as LiDAR, it's sensitive to both vegetation as well as bare earth. The second data set that we use is a UAS, uncrewed aerial system. This is a drone. Collected this data set in 2017. Data set was produced using structure for motion techniques from optical photographs. It's therefore primarily sensitive to the top of vegetation. So the UAS data set is hosted by Open Topography. I use Open Topography's Poetry Viewer to visualize the data set. So here is the data set. It's collected with a drone using optical photographs, so it does in fact have color. We can see that the fault trace comes through here. Move this around a little bit to get a better sense of the 3D structure. Just change the color to better show elevation here associated with the fault. So here it's now colors by classification. And so these orange points are points that are classified as ground, and the gray are points that are classified as vegetation. To calculate the displacement or the offset, we use 3D topographic differencing, and this is implemented with the iterative closest point algorithm. This is shown here, where we have two topography data sets. The first data set in the literature called the compare is shown in blue. The second data set in the literature called the reference is shown in red. So we take windowed subsets of both data sets. The length of the window is typically on the order of 40 to 50 meters. For this project, we use 40 meters. And then we use the iterative closest point to align these two data sets. And so here's an example. We see this benched topography. This alignment is done with a rigid deformation. So for the topographic differencing, we're differencing the structure for motion UAS topography with the LiDAR topography. This is challenging because the data sets have very different characteristics. First, their point density varies by a factor of about 100. Second, they have different sensitivity to vegetation. So we take an approach where we build different filters to help reconcile these differences in the data set, and we evaluate the filters based on which ones give the lowest errors in the displacements. So the plot here on the right shows displacement correlation uncertainty, measured uncertainty of the scatter in local displacements versus window size. And these symbols represent different filters. So for the horizontal, we see the use of single flight as well as wilderness classified ground points produce lowest errors. And then for the vertical displacements, the wilderness ground classification produces the lowest errors. And in the end, we preferred the use of the wilderness ground classification. Here are the topographic differencing results. This plot on the left, long axis here is the northwest direction, and the colors show the right lateral displacement. We see here on the southwest side of the fault, it's a very strong red color indicating motion towards the northwest. On the opposite side of the fault, it's a blue color indicating motion to the southeast. So here with the topographic differencing resolved clear right lateral slip that is very localized to the San Andreas fault. This middle plot here, we're still looking along strike. The x-axis is offset. I'd like you to pay attention to the blue line, and this is the right lateral or northwest displacement discontinuity. So it's essentially looking at right lateral offset, where we calculate an average slip rate of 2.5 plus or minus 0.2 centimeters per year. This plot here shows shear strain. This yellow color is the high right lateral shear strain. These black lines are the predicted orientation of mode 1 opening cracks. We see that the shear strain is high in the zone very localized to the fault. So we conclude that the topographic differencing shows that slip is highly localized to the San Andreas fault. Surface fractures are the smallest scale of deformation that we use in this project. At the Dry Lake Valley site, a set of surface fractures were discovered by co-author Nathan Toke when he was doing his paleoseismic work. And we saw that they aligned the fault trace. Total, we measured 119 fractures that form this left stepping en echelon pattern. One of the challenges of working with these fractures and determining the creep that they accommodate was knowing when they were open. So by looking at records of rainfall at a nearby station, we determined that the most likely time of opening of these fractures was from April 2013 to September 2014. Our next step was to calculate the slip rate and the opening rate from these fractures. And then using this math, this gives us the fact that these opening mode fractures accommodates 2.2 plus or minus about half a centimeter per year of right lateral fault slip. We look at fracture orientation to gain a better understanding of how the faulting can control these fractures. So assuming these fractures are mode 1 or opening mode fractures, we would expect that they form a 45-degree angle with the San Andreas fault. The plot on the left here shows the predicted mode 1 fracture orientations based on topographic differencing strain field. We find that the fractures have a mean orientation of about 9 degrees, so they form a 48-degree angle with the San Andreas fault. These show the field measurements. They have a mean orientation of 1 degree, forming a 40-degree angle with the San Andreas fault. So both of the fracture orientations measured in the field and those predicted from the topographic differencing strain are consistent with these fractures being mode 1. So we conclude that the fractures that we observed in the field form due to fault slip and are primarily not desiccation cracks. They formed and then remained open because there was no rain to saturate the soil and close the cracks. And the fracture opening may be modulated by creep events. So what have we learned from this project? We see, based on comparisons of the topographic differencing and the fracture slip rates, that 90 plus or minus 30% of the 1 kilometer aperture deformation is localized to within 5 meters of the San Andreas fault. Along the fault, a majority of the deformation is accommodated by surface fractures. These fractures and stay open in response to the drought. The opening could also be due to accelerated creep events. However, there's minimal InSAR satellites in orbit at the time, and so we cannot test this hypothesis. And we conclude that the deformation is consistent with a mature San Andreas fault. We would expect the deformation to be highly localized. Likely the localization has to do with the fault being locally well oriented for right lateral strike slip motion. I will now compare the creep rates from the study to those from the literature along the central San Andreas fault. This plot here shows creep rate in millimeters per year versus latitude. Dry Lake Valley is here, shown with this gray line. The blue is the rate with uncertainty from the fractures. The red is the measure from the topographic differencing. And then the other symbols represent creep rates from alignment arrays, cultural features, creep meters, and InSAR. So we see that actually all of these rates at Dry Lake Valley are within uncertainty of each other. So this shows that topographic differencing is able to resolve tectonic creep rates. So in conclusion, today I've discussed how we've measured tectonic creep at 3 spatial scales: InSAR, topographic differencing, and surface fractures. These measurements of creep show that tectonic deformation is localized to a narrow fault trace. Using topographic differencing, we can resolve deformation along and adjacent to the fault, and we resolve a rate of 2.5 plus or minus 0.2 centimeters per year, which is consistent with other data sets, including InSAR and alignment arrays. We show that surface fractures that were open during a period of drought accommodate 2.2 plus or minus about half a centimeter per year of right lateral slip, and combining topographic differencing and surface fractures, rates suggest that 90% of the creep over 1 kilometer aperture is localized to 5 meters. I'd like to thank the organizers of this session, and here's the reference for the paper that I've been discussing today. Thank you for hearing my talk.